I'm going to be talking to New Westminster City Councillor Patrick Johnstone, who was instrumental in the development of the city's new e-mobility plan, which includes e-micromobility. So welcome to the interview, Patrick.
Thank you, Markham.
Now, I'm really interested in this because we're seeing a plethora of new e-micromobility devices. We're talking about electric scooters, electric bikes, electric skateboards. I mean, anything you can put wheels on is being electrified. And what really interests me is how that works with existing infrastructure, like the SkyTrain in the Lower Mainland, where you're British Columbia, where you're located. And it seems to me that combined with electric cars and trucks, all of this is giving consumers a new, more choices to get to where they want to, cleaner and actually cheaper than it used to be. And New West is one of the few cities I see who's actually, thought this through and is bringing together a strategy. So, kudos to you folks. Maybe we can start with just a brief introduction or an overview of the city strategy, please.
Okay. Well, the City of New Westminster is a dense urbanized city. So we have 80,000 residents living in New West, and we're only just about 15 square kilometers. So it's a dense urban city. It's a historic center of Metro Vancouver. So that means we have a lot of the pre-automobile fabric of a really walkable community. And we're really excellently served by regional transit. We have 5 rapid transit stations in New Westminster. So because of this, we have one of the highest transit mode shares of any city in Canada. But still, about half of the community's greenhouse gas emissions come from transportation. It comes from cars and trucks in the city. And this remains our biggest source of emissions. So our e-mobility strategy we started with the idea of just how do we accelerate the electrification of personal transportation. So it involves both the transition from internal combustion cars to electric vehicles, but it also supports all those e-micromobility devices that you were talking about. It's also, New Westminster is a hilly city, and our transit stations are all along the bottom of the hill. And these kind of devices really have the benefit of flattening hills, making all those transits, increasing the walking shed to all those transit stations so that more people have access to transit, more people have different options for getting around.
Well, that's fascinating. And we should point out that in 2019, City Council passed declared a climate emergency. So that sort of sets the framework for this. And one of the things I was impressed about when I went over your e-mobility roadmap is how comprehensive it is. There's a lot in there. And let me just read a few of them out there. So you want an education campaign for the safe use of and benefits of e-micro mobility, advocate for the changes of the Motor Vehicle Act, that's the provincial level, monitor e-scooter pilot programs, advocate for e-bike incentive programs. There's a lot in here about e-bikes, including building infrastructure, things like so you can go someplace and lock your bike up, or it's going to be safely stored, those kinds of things. And so it sounds like there was a lot of thought and put into this. It seems quite comprehensive.
Yeah, I mean, we had a lot of conversation with the community, and we did talk a lot about what are the barriers to adoption of these new technologies, e-bikes and e-scooters and such. And they really come down to 2 basic types of barriers. One is just the safety and comfort of use. And that comes down to sort of safe routes in the city, making sure we're building the right type of infrastructure so that people using these devices are both not endangered by the vehicles they're sharing space with, but also not creating discomfort or danger for pedestrians who are trying to use pedestrian spaces. When you don't create adequate spaces for this type of technologies, they end up using the sidewalk, and that creates a new kind of conflict that we have to be very mindful of.
If you don't mind me, I just want to interrupt, Patrick. If you don't mind me asking, what strategies did the city come up with to minimize both of those threats, both on the road and to keep these devices off the sidewalks?
Yeah, that's an ongoing piece of work right now. So we're working on a core network of mobility lanes in the city right now, and we're working on the engineering of those. And that really involves 2 things. One is where appropriate, we're building protected mobility lanes and mobility lanes spaces on the roads where these types of devices can operate safely or more comfortably. What we traditionally would have called bike lanes, but we're now expanding to include not just bikes, or e-bikes, but also including scooters, including electric wheelchairs, including a lot of different types of mobility devices. But there's also, we build those where those are places where there's also a sidewalk for pedestrians to walk on, and making sure we're very mindful about how we're developing and designing our intersections to make sure that those intersection conflicts don't come into play. But there's also a role for MUPs, for multi-use paths. If you're on the island, you're familiar with probably the queen of all multi-use paths, the galloping goose. And there are strategies to make sure that those spaces where pedestrians and mobility devices are expected to share space, where we can make it safer, whether that's the design on how wide it is or how we create regulations about how it's used. So it's a work in progress on that. One of the challenges right now that we face, really looking into this, is that there's a real lack of clarity about where e-devices belong. The Motor Vehicle Act is, excuse me, the Motor Vehicle Act is from the 1950s still, and it really hasn't kept up with the change in technology and how people move around. So it hasn't even really adapted to people cycling a lot in cities, and these new technologies are causing a new stress for the Motor Vehicle Act. So part of our work is advocating to senior governments to find a right place for these devices, to figure out what the regulatory regime is that allows them to operate. Because we don't want a regulatory regime that shuts them out and makes them illegal, because there are so many goals that our region is trying to achieve as far as reducing the emissions of our transportation around the livability of our urban areas, that these devices can really add to and improve. And we don't want to be stuck in a Motor Vehicle Act that limits them.
I want to ask about transit, because you mentioned that high use of transit in New West. You have 5 rapid transit centers. And how do you perceive e-micro mobility devices working with, feeding into the transit system on both ends, when when you take it and then when you arrive at your destination?
Yeah, so like I said, we have 5 SkyTrain stations in New Westminster, and they're all at the bottom of the hill. And New Westminster is a very hilly city. So part of the idea is, if people right now, people can walk, a lot of people in the city can walk to transit. We're designing our city around increasing density within walkable distance of transit. That's sort of 400 meters quick walk, so you don't have to plan out your trip to the transit station. But adding e-mobility or e-micromobility to that just increases that walk shed considerably and makes more people in our city, gives more people in our city easy access to fast and rapid transit. The second challenge in that, and I talked a little bit about routes and the challenge about making the moving spaces safe and accessible for e-micromobility, but storage is the other thing, the other barrier that we've talked about, the end of trip facilities. So an e-bike obviously costs much more than a regular bicycle, and secure parking becomes a really important thing for people to comfortably use them to get around. So I think there's a role we have to work with our regional transit authority, with TransLink, to make sure that we have secure, safe storage for e-bikes at transit stations. They are doing it in some transit stations around the Lower Mainland, and our stations need to be updated to have that. Yeah.
Well, one of the questions I have for you, Patrick, and you alluded to some of this in your other answers, but it seems like that when you have a city with it's an older city, it was designed, when it was built, it wasn't designed with cars in mind, let alone electric scooters and so on, and electric bikes. So what kind of engineering challenges does that present when you're trying to figure out how to make this strategy work? And is it, at the end of the day, is it possible to come up with a strategy and build the infrastructure so that cars, e-mobility devices, all of that works better than it does now?
The simple answer is yes. I don't think it's as big an engineering challenge as we might think. I think there are rapidly evolving and great standards. I mean, the province with their active transportation strategy has a great set of standards for new mobility lanes and for assuring various things, that we don't have conflict areas with pedestrians, that we make sure the lanes don't compromise accessibility for people who have visual impairments or have other accessibility needs. The challenge is financial and somewhat political. It is slightly expensive to redesign city streets for a smaller municipality. We're 80,000 people, but we don't have a bottomless budget. So we have to think about how we allocate those funds and how much we're spending on this related to the other traditional things we spend money on when it comes to transportation in the city. And there's a bit of a political pushback whenever you make change like this. Building new mobility lanes is a challenge for some people. They don't see that as something they particularly will use. So you have to be a little bit bold, and you have to be willing to make the investment and recognize that the city of New Westminster in 2050 is going to be a very different city than it is now if we're going to achieve any of our climate goals as a city. So we have to be thinking ahead to what the city needs to look like in the decades ahead, instead of just trying to continually apply 1950s solutions to transportation in our city.
No,
I think the City of New Westminster, I just want to say one addition to that. New Westminster also tries to put an equity lens into all of our climate actions. And there's an accessibility barrier to, if we just slot out the internal combustion vehicles and put in electric vehicles, there's a cost barrier to a lot of people in our community to being able to afford a new electric vehicle. And there's other urban goals that we're trying to achieve around safety and livability of our neighborhoods. It's not going to be achieved if we just replace the gas cars we have now with electric vehicles we have now. So it is a very broad sort of replanning of what the city looks like. And it's not just a climate strategy, it's a livability, and it's a happy city strategy.
It seems like, this strategy isn't going to be implemented tomorrow. It's not like you suddenly, you go out and build all this infrastructure and the problem is solved. This seems like a process over many years. There'll be mistakes and errors and, oh, I wish we had thought of that, or oops, got that wrong, better go back and change it. So it seems like messaging, because you mentioned politics, and that gets back to messaging and conversations and consulting with communities and voters and so on. How big a role does that play in this strategy?
Yeah, I'll say in the first part, one thing the City of New Westminster has started to do with new mobility lanes is we do some consultation on them ahead of time, of course, like you always do in the city when you're building new infrastructure or changing infrastructure. But after a round of consultation, we got into this practice of building a temporary lane. We build it with inexpensive materials, flexi posts and paint and glued down materials. And we do that as a sort of a second phase of consultation. So you install the temporary, it's safe, it's protected, but it doesn't have the heavy and expensive infrastructure necessarily. And then you try it out. And what you learn from that is, as people start to use the infrastructure, you start to find those little areas where you didn't maybe get the design exactly right, or you could improve the safety of an intersection. And then after going through that process, you do more consultation, and then you build your final design based on that sort of second phase. Consultation is always expensive in a city. We underestimate the cost of spending a lot of time for staff talking to people and having conversations with the community and assembling that information together into a comprehensive report. So putting a little bit of that money into engineering and a little bit of that money into trying things out on the ground so that people actually have a better understanding of what they're talking about. Lines on maps on bike lanes are one thing, but when they actually hit the ground, people actually see what they look like, and it does provide a different sort of type of feedback.
Sure, that makes a lot of sense. It's almost like a pilot project. And
yeah, we never say pilot in local government, because a pilot always, nothing is never more permanent than a pilot project. But being able to try out with low cost materials in order just to as a test to find out whether we have the design right or not is probably a better way to think about it.
Gotcha. Well, Patrick, thank you very much. There's fascinating insights into what New West is doing. Good luck with your strategy.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your time, Markham.